Thank you for being here today. As you can see, my presentation is from Vinegar and Cotton Balls to Diaphragms and Vasectomies, Sex and Birth Control in Urban China, 1949 to 1961. My presentation assumes a sort of base understanding of, or a base familiarity with modern Chinese history, so I'll try to bring you up to speed before we get started. So, Zheng Xiaoming was the driver of local bus number 8009 in Beijing. The year was 1958. One day while taking a break at work, Zheng spotted an attractive young bus driver, Xu Shiyu, also taking a break. Intrigued, Zheng approached Xu. After several unsuccessful attempts at wooing her, Zheng learned that Xu liked to read and offered to lend her a book on the condition that she return it later to his home. Xu consented, and their affair began. Before consummating their relationship, Zheng assured Xu that she would not get pregnant because he always carried a condom with him, or he always used a condom that he carried with him for this purpose. The relationship ended only on November 30th, 1965, when the couple came under fire for licentiousness and hooligan-like behavior. This story is excerpted from an original political confession I found in Stanford University's rare archive of Communist Party confessions and personnel documents. What can the modern reader learn from such a document? Is the case of Zheng and Xu representative of most reproductive practices in 1950s and 1960s China? Scholars of China have argued that a focus on the state and society rather than on the individual and Marxist denial of gender difference meant that sexuality and reproduction were rarely discussed. Whenever birth control policy or the state policing of sex is mentioned, it typically focuses on the one-child policy, the name says it all, reports of coerced sterilization, and official Communist Party directives. But rarely is the lived experience of using contraception discussed, especially before the implementation of the one-child policy in 1979, by which it was mandated that all couples could have at most one child. Most historians agree that during the early years of the People's Republic of China, the government promoted pronatalism, encouraging women to produce as many children as possible to augment the workforce and fuel the communist cause. In this context, there was little room for individual fertility control, and therefore birth control was not even a possibility in most cases. I asked, to what extent were state policies on sex successful in influencing individual behavior, and how are they limited? I draw on women's magazines, birth planning propaganda, newspaper articles, and previously unexamined personnel files from the Stanford University Cadre Archives. Before I get to my conclusions, I want to make some clarifications that typically, if I give this talk in a China-centric framework, I get asked these questions, so I'll preemptively try to address them. My purpose for investigating birth control is not to make a sweeping argument about demographic change in China, nor to assess the efficacy of a particular birth control method, but to interrogate the ways by which and circumstances in which individuals attempted to regulate their own fertility, along with the cultural practices surrounding sex. In this presentation and the longer paper it comes from, the terms contraception and birth control are used interchangeably to refer to any method practiced to prevent pregnancy, including abortion, vaginal suppositories, condoms, and homemade remedies. This presentation will provide snapshots of urban birth control rhetoric and use, as well as individual sexual and contraceptive experiences during two periods in modern Chinese history that were particularly rich on this topic. The first, this is my brief timeline of Chinese history. 1949, People's Republic of China was founded. So the first period I look at is from 1949 to 1952, in the early years of the PRC. This period, I'm going to argue, reflects continuities with the previous regime, which some have argued was less repressive. Next, I look at the period from 1957 to 1961. So in 1956, Chairman Mao declared, "Let 100 flowers bloom. Let's have everyone speak out against the new society, let's have openness, la 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 la, let's be happy. Then, once everyone spoke out, 1957 rolls around and the anti-rightist campaign cracks down on all of the people who spoke out. Surprise, surprise. All the birth control advocates who had come out of their respective corners were repressed, supposedly, and access to birth control was cut off. Then, in one of the biggest catastrophes in modern Chinese history, from 1958 to 1961, Mao unleashed the Great Leap Forward to shift China from an agrarian economy to a socialist one through industrialization and collectivization in a mere 3-year period. This unfortunately resulted in a death toll of 18 to 30 million people in 3 years. And supposedly, birth control basically fell off the map. So my arguments, or my findings, are that in China's 2 largest cities, which don't make up a large portion of the country, but are still massive, like the state of California in terms of population, certain sexual practices endured from earlier periods endured in the early years of the PRC and through political instability. Contraceptives and abortions, illegal and yet widely available to urban couples before the communist takeover, remained available to urbanites in the PRC seeking greater sexual freedom despite the political instability and pro-natalist policies. Furthermore, information about contraceptive use, as well as the basics of sex ed, continued to circulate through popular literature. This undermines depictions of the Mao period as one of widespread puritanism and absolute control over all aspects of private life. And that's a statement that basically, I would say 90% of people who study China is like a baseline statement that everyone agrees about, that everything was puritanical. So, while formally considered bourgeois, Malthusian, and capitalist, and therefore suspicious, birth control use endured because some people believed it facilitated state modernizing efforts and could offer a solution to lagging grain production and the resulting grain shortages, both pressing problems that peaked in the crisis of the Great Leap Forward. Just now, I mentioned the term sex ed. That's, as you may know, indeed a Western concept, but I use it as a kind of a stand-in for asking how was knowledge about sex shared, and I conclude that in this period it was shared through jokes, stories, songs, hearsay, magazines, guidebooks, and watching animals mate. And there are actually stories of children going to the farm to watch animals copulate to learn about sex. So here we go. This would have been, when I show this to my classmates, they're often horrified because this is a highly repressive, highly conservative period in Chinese history, and there you go. You pop open a magazine, and there's a vagina. So this vagina is from 1951. I think somebody was talking about sex. So what types of birth control options were available to urban couples? Well, surprisingly, or not surprisingly at all, IUDs were an option, intrauterine devices, diaphragms, spermicidal jellies, condoms, spermicidal jellies and condoms. These are images that I found from 1958 at the beginning of the Great Leap Forward during the period of repression of birth control advocates. But it doesn't seem that they're very repressed at this point if here we have images of how to insert vaginal suppositories. This says like birth control hanging images from 1958. And this is how to use a condom. And as in the story I began with about Mr. Zheng saying, oh, don't worry, you won't get pregnant. I always carry a condom for this purpose. Well, he meant literally one condom that he used over and over. So here, this image is showing you how to wash and treat your one condom so it lasts forever, ideally. So surprisingly or not surprisingly, these items were widely available in cities and affordable if not free. Unfortunately, the catch was that they were often either ineffective or of poor quality and could lead to permanent physiological damage, such as the burning of the vaginal canal, etc. Alternatives, though, might offer more options. There's a long tradition of herbal abortifacients in China. Imperial and Republican era, this is the periods before the founding of the PRC. In those periods, elite women and prostitutes, particularly women in polygynous marriages, are shown to have used abortifacients to induce bleeding or abortion. These, in many cases, were effective and are still used today and can be found today in China. Feminist scholars like Francesca Bray and Charlotte Firth have argued that in imperial times, some women actually avoided intercourse with their husbands or used abortifacients to put off pregnancy as long as possible. Because giving birth could mean a loss of the woman's autonomy and a break, it represented a symbolic break with her natal family. Furthermore, in an early and influential Chinese medical text, the Huangdi Neijing, the Emperor's Inner Canon, argues that in some cases, the regularity of menstruation, which was indicative of bodily harmony, balance between yin and yang, was more important than pregnancy. So abortifacients would be used to induce bleeding to restore equilibrium. The Compendium of Materia Medica, Bansao Gangmu, published in the 17th century, but based on treatments from thousands of years earlier, provides information on 30 different types of herbs that can be used to induce abortion, and these are commonly found herbs. Likewise, the 1960s Barefoot Doctor's Manual used by health workers, mobile health workers, who gave health services to probably more than 1 billion people. This manual itself cites numerous herbal recipes for abortion. Another option would have been what was listed in the title, homemade diaphragms from acetic acid, which is the active ingredient in vinegar, if it's not diluted, and cotton balls. There you go. So this is a tried and true method of how it's called, the top says, China's mother problem, which is a whole other basket of issues. But it's arguing that even in your kitchen or pantry, anyone can make contraceptives. It's so easy. Here's a demonstration. And as strange, or maybe not strange as this sounds, actually other types of birth control devices, including suppositories made from cotton balls and cocoa butter or other viscous substances like olive oil or honey, were used in pre-modern Europe and in the pre-modern Muslim world to prevent pregnancies. It's unclear how effective they were, and scholars have argued about it. I haven't tried it personally. Welcome to. Contraceptives such as condoms that I mentioned earlier and diaphragms would have been used repeatedly and cleaned and maintained through special care. The rhythm method and withdrawal method were also were advocated at all levels of government, not just in China, but all over the world. Then there would have been the less common option of sterilization. Tubal ligations for women and vasectomies for men. And these are images that I found in a fun afternoon reading magazine about how to get your tubes tied or get a vasectomy. And this is illustrating either getting your tubes tied or getting an IUD inserted. So unfortunately, sterilization practices today, as in the past, reflected gendered power dynamics. So though a vasectomy is arguably a simple, marginally intrusive surgery, and tubal ligations for women are, at this time, were much more dangerous and highly invasive. If one partner must have sterilization surgery, women are far more likely to get one than men because of notions of masculinity. Another option for women seeking or couples seeking fertility control would have been abortions. In 1952, the only women in China eligible for sterilizations or abortions were those at least 35 years old who had 6 or more children and were severely ill. At least in theory, women demanding abortions needed written permission from their husbands and work units, revealing women's lack of agency in this personal matter. I'm running out of time. Okay. Prior to 1954, the process of uterine dilation and curettage, or D&C, was the primary means of inducing abortion in China. However, after 1958, abortions were conducted with pills or vacuum suctioning. Has anyone ever heard of vacuum suctioning? That's the, yeah? Have you seen the images? No. So it's essentially, the doctor creates a vacuum chamber inside a bottle and sucks out the fetus. And I think this is still the basis for abortions in some cases today, but it just doesn't look quite so shoddy, I think. And I found numerous manuals that show how to make one in your kitchen, how to, remove a fetus from a friend or a daughter. So that could have been a viable option for some women. So who exactly was using birth control? People always ask me this, oh, this was like 2 people that had access to this. Well, though the Chinese government claimed to have done away with class differences at this point, there was indeed a class dimension to birth control use. Urban women and couples were far more likely to use birth control than rural couples. Sociologist Wang Feng has shown that between 1955 and 1959, urban women were 13 times more likely to have abortions than rural women. Literate women were also more likely to have abortions. Wang Feng has also shown that before 1965, women with at least a junior high school education were 15 times more likely to have an abortion than illiterate women, but this gap later closed. And finally, elite courtesans and prostitutes. As during the imperial and republican periods, abortion was widely practiced among elite prostitutes during the Mao period, even though officially there was no prostitution during this period. And one small tidbit, in the Republican period, the period preceding the communist takeover, up through the 1950s, prostitutes utilized folk remedies involving the consumption of snails or tadpoles to prevent pregnancy. In 1958, the government launched an official campaign against the consumption of tadpoles as a form of birth control because it was so prevalent. And tadpoles were chosen because they resembled sperm. And I don't think I'm not sure if that practice continues, but people still are aware of it, that it used to happen. So in conclusion, reproductive practices in Maoist China were far from uniform. Urban women and couples might have used condoms, homemade or store-bought diaphragms, homemade herbal abortifacients, the rhythm method, or numerous other techniques to control their fertility. There was considerably more agency in individual decision-making in the realm of sex and birth control than previously realized. Thank you.